Welcome to the Alumni Conversation Series. I'm Munati Kondile, the Communications Manager at the Alumni and Development Office. Today we've got two authors, academics, who've written a book called Pan-Africanism and Psychology in Decolonial Times. And it's Associate Professor Shose Kessi and Professor Floretta Boonzaier, who will introduce themselves. I think let me let you introduce yourselves and also tell us a bit about your relationship and how you came about to write this book together.
Okay, I'm Shose Kessi. Currently I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at UCT, but I'm also based in the Psychology Department. I'm Associate Professor and I teach social and critical psychology. I'm not teaching at the moment. And yeah, I came to UCT in 2011 as a lecturer in the psychology department. And that's where I met Floretta. And we, I guess we had a connection around the work that we do, which eventually led to many collaborations, including this book, but also setting up the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa, which is located in the department. And yeah, so I think we just share common interests around critical questions of psychology, questions around Pan-Africanism and psychology, and many others.
So I'm Floretta Boonzaier, Professor in Psychology. Have been in the Psychology Department since 2004 as a lecturer. Did my PhD there as well. And I teach around kind of critical psychology of gender, critical decolonial approaches to research methodology. And yes, that's Shose and I met in 2011, but we've had, as Shose said, a number of collaborations over the years because our work around kind of thinking more critically about psychology as a discipline, but also around identity and the intersecting identities and how that plays itself out in people's lives has been a shared interest that we've been working on. A number of different approaches. So this book was just one form of collaboration.
And the Hub, you mentioned the Hub. Tell us a bit more. I know you mentioned it a bit. What is it? Where is it? Is it accessible to everyone, alumni?
So
the Hub is it's a physical space in the first instance, yes. So it's located on the ground floor of the Psychology Department. And it emerged out of, again, our collaborative work, ourselves, with other colleagues, with our students, primarily, in terms of thinking about psychology, the authority of psychology as a discipline, but how we need to begin to ask critical questions about the history of psychology and how it operates in the present. So it's a physical space, but also a kind of discursive space in which our students primarily have taken ownership. And we had a launch in 2018. We've had a number of different events like film screenings, talks, book launches, conversations around questions of intersectional identities and oppressions, questions about race, gender, class, violence, historical and contemporary violence, systemic forms of violence. What other questions?
Institutional racism.
Yeah. How does it work? Do you just go there at any time?
Well, we have events. So we use the space for teaching, small classes, or supervision with students. But we have a number of events. It was much more active, obviously, before COVID, but we're getting back on track now. We meet usually once a week on a Friday. Now it's probably twice a month. and we invite different guests to speak, or we might have a film screening, or we might have a student presenting their current research. So a variety of different types of engagements. Most of them are student-led, so we really encourage our students to take ownership of the space and to come with their ideas of what they want to do with it.
Okay. And as African scholars, I know, Floretta, you mentioned this, that the history of psychology is a bit problematic. African scholars teaching psychology, knowing full well the background and where it comes from, is Euro-American origins. How are you finding it to teach such, and what are you doing towards the transformation of psychology?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's a question that is a continuous one, right? Of course, there are those who would say that the roots of psychology are not necessarily Western, and that there's a lot of influence from Egyptian theories, for instance, about personality. But where the problem comes is how mainstream Western forms of psychology, as we know them today, have theorized about Black people, African people, as a way of legitimizing imperial conquests, slavery. So I think those were deliberate attempts to use academic knowledge with a political aim and gains. But it's not to say that then the study of psychology is necessarily that in its entirety. And I think there's a lot we can do with psychology as a field that's trying to understand human behavior. And there's been a lot of critical perspectives on psychology, coming from African psychologists, but also psychologists from around the world, in Latin America, New Zealand, so the global South, basically. So there's a whole field out there of critically oriented psychologies that are attempting to give a different perspective from what we consider mainstream Western psychology.
But we also confront that history head on, right? We teach about it in a way that talks about psychology's complicity with scientific racism. And it's quite interesting to see the reaction of students, because sometimes, students choose particular courses, and it may be that sometimes it's only in third year or honors when they encounter the kind of critical conversations that we have about the history of psychology, complicity with colonization, apartheid, scientific racism, all of that. And it's interesting, that students will often say, but this is the first time they encounter that kind of thinking about psychology. So we tackle the history head on, and then allow conversations to move into, so this is the history, and what is our responsibility in the present, given ongoing forms of racism, injustice, systemic injustice. What is our responsibility located in this discipline with this particular history?
And you also talk about a number of other types of psychology. Go into feminist psychology, indigenous psychology, and liberation psychology. Do you want to just maybe expand on those? What role does that bring to the discussion about psychology?
Well, maybe to say that these, I guess they're called, we have different names for them because they are emerging organically in different spaces. So the impact of colonization in South America will be a little different because of that particular context, and the same thing with indigenous communities across the world, how they approach their own resistance, liberation, decolonial aspirations will be different because of the context. So I think this is, but there's a lot of commonalities between these different forms of psychology, in the sense that they are critiques of Western psychology, and they are attempts at reclaiming the discipline in a way that works for us, as a way, in a way that we talk about, in the book we talk about a psychology of resistance and liberation. And I think for me that encompasses all these different types of psychologies. But we're more interested in the Pan-African versions for this book because that's where we are located.
And we're going to go into the book very shortly. I just want, in reading the book, I saw there was African psychology. You go into that, but there's little reference to spirituality or religion, or I don't know if that's something you deliberately avoid as psychologists, or did I miss it somewhere?
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, a lot of the African psychology that emerged in the US in particular, I think in the 1960s, they did talk about spirituality and different cosmologies as very important to integrate into the discipline. I think for us, we're taking a more like political orientation, and so trying to not fall into the trap of essentializing the discipline in any way. So not trying to claim that there's some kind of common African spirituality or cosmology, or and trying to hold on to that universal claim that there's something about us as humans and our behaviors that we might share in common. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I think I think the point about not essentializing is key. And so it's not about avoiding questions of spirituality and how they shape our lives as persons. It's not to say that that's not important, that's very important. But in the book, it's a kind of almost overarching kind of question about thinking about Pan-African psychology in this current moment and the possibilities it offers us to deal with the questions that we face on the continent. Contemporary questions that are fundamentally shaped, we know, by our histories of colonization and slavery.
I had a question that was going to say, let's break down the title of the book, Pan-Africanism in Psychology in Decolonial Times. I think maybe let's go into Pan-Africanism. I recall sitting in a African Month event with Naledi Pandor, and everyone was giving a different version of Pan-Africanism, and the book also goes into those histories from various scholars. But according to both of you, what Pan-Africanist lens are you using to go into the subject?
I think for me, Pan-Africanism, or the desire to reclaim Pan-Africanism in this book and to make the links with psychology is really around a shared experience of colonization, trauma, based on our common identity as Africans. So Africans in the continent, Africans in the diaspora, and how these things, these injuries, I guess, from the past manifests now. I think, we live amongst a lot of trauma, whether it's directly experienced or whether it's intergenerational or whether it's epigenetic. People live the traumas of the past and they manifest in everyday life. And I think what's so attractive about Pan-Africanism is that the movement and the ideology was really around trying to bring people together through solidarity, through these common experiences, to build something, to build a better life, to focus on well-being and to reclaim our aspirations as African people in the world. So that's very broad kind of definition, but of course there's been many iterations of what that means and how it looks like. And without wanting to romanticize these ideals, because of course we know that on this continent there's a lot of injury and conflict. And so, it's I guess it's a way of trying to understand it, and build understanding, solidarity, consciousness around what Pan-Africanism can bring for us.
For me, that the question about the kind of Pan-Africanism, I think, in addition to what Shose said, I think for me what's central and what also comes up in the book is around around feminist activism, Pan-African feminist activism, that for me shapes my thinking about Pan-Africanism, right? So if you think about, for instance, the global representation of African women, what that means, right, in the global imagination, what it means to be an African woman. And then you look at the reality of feminist political activism and the ways in which it has enabled change and resistance across the continent. For me, that's the power, and building solidarities and alliances and raising consciousness around questions of violence, work, the range of issues. I think that for me is about challenging that stereotype of what an African woman is or looks like and is in need of saving, by raising examples of the kinds of Pan-African organizing that women are doing.
Then in chapter 7, in fact, I want to go into the issues of the traumas as well as. But are you offering Pan-Africanist psychology as a solution or as an answer to resolving some of these things that traditional psychology has been unable to do? I mean, you speak of restorative justice, you speak about the truth not being able to actually fix things, or is this the solution that you're proffering?
Yeah, I think
simple answer. Well, not quite.
Psychology is a discipline that's been historically focused on understanding the individual. So the individual is like the most important variable, And what we're saying is that actually the individual lives in a broader context, in a broader social context. And we can't understand the individual outside of that context. I mean, that's what social psychologists do, right? But I think where social psychology as well as a discipline is lacking is that context is not just your family or your community or your country. It's actually a global context. And this is what I think Pan-Africanism, why it adds value to psychology, because Pan-Africanism is a global movement. It's a global understanding about how racist, patriarchal, imperial conquest has had an impact on people in communities. And we need to engage with ordinary people in everyday life to make those linkages. And I think if it can go a long way in kind of addressing the psychological traumas that we live amongst.
Yeah, And I think to bring it again back to the question of resistance, right? So where the resistances and the consciousness raising and all of that happens is not individual within the individual, it's in community, it's in solidarity with others. And that's where a recognition of the shared histories of colonization and slavery and how that manifests in our current moment is that Pan-African recognition is important, I think, for building the solidarities and the resistance and the understanding of what that means. And not, I think what is also quite important for us is, like, both of us have done work in different contexts where it's clear that our reading of particular problems, whether it's racism, whether it's violence against women, has pathologized particular groups of people, right? There are particular discourses in the field of gender-based violence, for example, that pathologize Black people, right? It's a problem for them. Whereas I think that opening up the lens to think about our shared histories and shared context actually makes us think a bit more in less pathologizing ways about what's how to recognize what's wrong and how to end it.
And then the book is actually quite diverse in terms of its topics. There's a part about xenophobia, where it goes to Alexander 2018, UCT, or the institutions in Africa. So I want us to go into UCT and frame this conversation now as people who are actually based at UCT, and how is this work, or how are you experiencing the university?
Yeah, I think it's just following on from what Floretta just mentioned. That chapter 5 was very much inspired by a research project that I did with Black students at UCT, and how they have been pathologized, because we talk about the achievement gap, and Black students overcrowding the university, bringing the standards down, etc., etc. And that is a real, typical racialized image of Black students. And there's been many studies all over the world talking about this. And so I think when we bringing a Pan-African lens onto this type of experience at UCT, it gives us an opportunity to be engaged with institutional racism and how it manifests itself in different ways, challenging the discourses around what counts as knowledge and achievement, acknowledging that people in this institution come from very different backgrounds, and that we haven't reached the point necessarily yet where we're catering for that diversity. And if we did, actually maybe we it's not a deficit. It will actually be beneficial to everyone, and make us more critical, and make our knowledge a lot more useful for us and for the continent. So yeah, I think that it's the nice thing about that chapter is that I guess it can link something that's happening at a very micro level in an institution to the broader ideas and concepts that we're talking about in the book.
So decolonial times, does that mean we're decolonized, or the process of decolonizing? What is decolonial times, and how do you achieve it?
I mean, I think there's recognition that it's an always ongoing process, whether we definitely haven't reached it, but what is it? It's an ongoing process, but there definitely is, I think, what's been called now a decolonial turn, right? Where conversations across a range of disciplines, but also in not just at the university, like in social movements themselves. There's a kind of resurgence in conversations about decoloniality, questions about social justice that bring histories very much into the present, questions about land that are important, and so for us, the social justice movements, but what's been happening in universities and across a range of disciplines, our own work on decolonizing psychology in different ways. That's the moment that we kind of speaking into when we talk about decolonial times.
Yeah, I agree. It's a process. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine what a decolonized society looks like because I think we're still trying to understand the full impact of colonization. And so as we, before 1994, what in South Africa, for example, the decolonial move was probably to gain political power. Now we understand that there are a lot of more other things that need to change as well. And the struggle is continuous, but it's different now. It's a lot more, It's a lot more subtle and less obvious and more difficult to identify sometimes. So yes, it's a process, definitely. And as the process unfolds, then we learn more and more and more about how colonization has actually had an impact.
So the hub is located, there's a school of thought that says you have to destroy completely and start afresh. So what we're doing is essentially moving into these spaces that are colonial and using the same languages that we were colonized in and trying to decolonize everything. What's your thinking around that?
I mean, we're making a big assumption, right, when we say we get rid of everything and start afresh, because what does that mean? Are we saying that if we start afresh, we can start without the baggage of the past, or are we just going to repeat the same kind of organizations that we know? We're the same people, so we come with the baggage.
We make the same mistakes.
We make the same mistakes. We will, but maybe when we work within institutions and within systems and identify the problems, the change is a lot slower. But maybe it's something. Maybe that's how it should be, slow and incremental. Because I don't know, the destruction. I don't know. It's hard to imagine what it would be replaced with and by whom.
But I think, there's also an assumption, in a sense, in that question that there's a decolonial project. There will be a finished project. There won't be a finished project. I think it's about being comfortable with ambiguity, with contradictions, with moving back and moving forward, moving back. It's like none of us can do this work. I mean, I work specifically on gender-based violence, and I was having a class this morning, and we were talking about violence, and it's really heavy stuff because there's been so much activism, feminist activism globally, but yet students are still coming into the classroom talking about having to just be extra careful about what they're wearing, and we're talking about sexual harassment. But none of us can do this work without being hopeful that things are changing, however slow, but also, also being comfortable with the idea that there will be contradictions, there will be discomforts, there will be things that don't, but also, like thinking about decoloniality as a finished project is perhaps unrealistic, but it doesn't prevent us from continuing to do the work that we do. Maybe that makes sense, but yeah.
I mean, in reading this book, I was left with the impression that psychology has a lot to do with social engineering, or has a role to play in social engineering, and thinking about how apartheid happened in South Africa and how there were psychologists involved in the process. So, how are you involved in this work towards, restructuring, or how are you? I mean, you're working on research already that has identified the problems. So, what is it that you're doing to change this future, or to, you've started Hub, initiatives like that. So, how are you advancing the change agenda as psychologists or academic psychology scholars?
I think you need to go first.
For me, being in the classroom, so there's the research aspect of it, which I can talk about as well. But for me, in the classroom, it's quite an important space in terms of not just teaching, but almost kind of that your teaching is a form of consciousness raising. But it's a collaborative space, right? Because you're learning together. But I think it's quite important that we teach students about the sordid history of psychology, but also opening up possibilities of doing things differently. I think that's work that advances social justice, that students will go out there and think more carefully about how, in the work that they do, how, even subtly stereotypes come up about who, where the problems are, who the problems are, how particular people and communities are pathologized. So on one level, that's the work we do in the classroom space and in the hub, in conversations that we have together. But I think in research as well, it's because the research that scientific racism, the research was part of that machinery, right? So academic research is also kind of colonial project, has been a colonial project to advance, social injustice.
Would you advocate for students to also practice that form of proactive, sort of biased type of research towards restructuring the past or fixing the injustices?
If that's what you're asking.
I'm just asking. Because if that is the mode of getting things done.
I mean, I'm sure our own research is probably biased in some ways. I mean, we learn about we have to be critically self-reflective always. So I would probably say to you, maybe 6-7 years ago, I did a piece of research, and now that I think about it, I would have done it very differently because I've learned so much over this time. And probably in 10 years, I'll say the same thing about some of the things I've done now. So I think the point is about being continuously self-reflective. And so some of this type of research that psychologists have done, I wouldn't want to supervise a student doing that kind of work. I mean, especially all the psychometric testing, intelligence testing. I just think, no, it's not necessary, and it has the potential of doing more damage than good. So yeah, I think just also maybe if I can add to what Floretta was saying, what was very moving at our book launch a couple of weeks ago is that the students spoke about their experience at the hub. And they often used words like, this space has saved my life. And I think that it was very moving for us, but also it kind of, for me, it was an acknowledgement, a recognition that the space is actually doing something to change psychology at UCT. And so that was some really positive feedback to get.
So there is work.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that thing, like if you think about the research Shose was talking about, in terms of how Black students at UCT in particular are, have been stereotyped and pathologized. And so the hub, I think, then is a way in which we countered that space and created a space for our students who are primarily Black to own the space, to take up space. And so I agree that the feedback from students was quite moving.
And then we have alumni who leave the university, Black alumni who don't want to have anything to do with the university because of those experiences. How then do you fix something that has now gone outside the university? How would you?
Yeah, I mean, I really wish we could bring them back in. I just, part of my own research prompted me to get involved in the Black Academic Caucus. Floretta was also a member, and maybe current, I don't know. Okay, good. No, it's complicated for me because I'm in a management position now. So of course I'm a very strong supporter, but not a formal member anymore. But that work was crucial. Like, we can't change how we teach in silos or how we do research in silos. It has to be part of a systemic change. We have to have the support of the university to be able, for our work to be effective and impactful. But during that time with BAC, we had very close ties to, now I can't remember the name of the organization, but the Black alumni, Uktaba.
Yes. So
I think that's one way maybe of us trying to reclaim those connections. But yeah, I mean, I'm guessing it's the work of your office as well to try and bring them back in. But and I hope that if they have the opportunity to listen to us through this session, maybe it can inspire them and send their children here and change their experience.
Okay, and then lastly, the book. What do you hope to achieve? And then I see that there's also a third author. I didn't go into this question earlier, but would you be able to tell us who did what in the book, wrote which section, contributed how, and then where do you see it going? Where do you see it doing?
For me, so I think in terms of process, we just we kind of conceptualized together. We took the lead on different chapters, but contributed across the book, just kind of working collaboratively that way. For me, the book is meant to open up a conversation, right? When you said earlier, Pan-African psychology. We don't actually propose a Pan-African psychology. We don't end with a Pan-African psychology. We talk about Pan-Africanism and psychology to open up this conversation, for us to think beyond, other categorizations, to say this is the conversation we're putting on the table now about the possibilities of bringing a Pan-African lens to psychology in this current moment. So that's the conversation I would hope the book opens up. For students and others in our discipline.
We've been creating networks with psychologists on the continent, and one of the things I'm really hoping for the book is that it can provide material, the beginning of materials, teaching materials for students on this continent, because the textbooks don't really represent us, so we need to write those textbooks actually, and maybe this book can provide some kind of theoretical context in which these teaching materials can emerge from. There's not a lot of psychology teaching happening outside of very specific places on the continent, and I think we need to continue to engage and build the relevance of our discipline for our own students.
Okay. I think that the very, very last question is, how do you filter or make what is inside this book trickle down into other communities like Olanga or someone sitting in Soweto? How do you get some of these ideas into the heads of people who don't have access to an academic library?
I mean, I guess the book is a tool, right? It's a tool, and it's a tool for the work that I do is mostly participatory action research work. So I'm always working with people in different communities, and my students do that kind of work. And so this is a tool for me, for them, to take into those communities through their own projects. So I think, it's not about having access to the book, but it's the ideas in the book that are important.
I agree. I think in some ways, on the one hand, particular kinds of conversations are already happening in Polanga and other places, right? But the questions around institutional racism, xenophobia, feminist organizing, that are ideas that can be taken up by our students, by ourselves in the work that we do, with different communities that will facilitate those conversations.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Maybe when you were coming here that you thought, I have to say this?
Read the book.
And I actually did read the book.
Yeah, I know you read it.
It's quite insightful. I mean, it took a while. The beginning part took a while, but then once I got to chapter 2 and it went on, I found it to be very interesting and informative. So thank you very much for a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope it does reach many more people.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we should just acknowledge that when we set up the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa, it was we received a grant from the Vice Chancellor, the Decoloniality grant, and so without that support, we wouldn't have come this far, and this book probably wouldn't exist. So
How long did it take you to write the book?
Ages.
No, it was quick. It was the quickest project I've ever worked on.
The proposal was done many years ago, but actually the book we wrote in less than a year.
It was, yeah. But thank you also for the conversation. That was actually about a lot more than the book itself. I really enjoyed
That's
the
what the book
conversation.
does.
Yeah.
Okay, right. No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's our episode of the Alumni Conversation series on YouTube. You can catch more of these on our YouTube channel, as well as connect with us and Floretta and Shose on alumniconnect.com.